Good afternoon and welcome to the Wavy Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're expecting to hear from Chief Mark Talbot, who's speaking about the Cody Bigsby verdict. Now that took place on Tuesday. If you've been following along, Cody Bigsby was found guilty of second-degree murder and hiding the body of his 3-year-old son, Cody Bigsby. Now Wavy's been following the case since Cody was first reported missing in January 2022. So it's about 2 years later, we have the verdict. Chris Horn is on site today at the press conference, and he'll keep us updated on what is happening there later today on Wavy. Now, some background: Cody Bigsby's body has still never been found, and on Tuesday the Hampton Commonwealth's attorney said it was a long road to resolution, but it's not closure, saying we may never know where Cody is. Chief Mark Talbot is getting ready to speak momentarily. You see him here.
Reaction to the verdict Tuesday in the Bigsby trial?
Sad. It doesn't bring the child back. I'm happy that the criminal justice system worked the way that it's supposed to, but it was a reminder of how incredibly sad the circumstance was and is.
Are you in close contact with Chief Weidman these days, as far as, because he made a comment in the press conference post-verdict Tuesday that the search continues and so forth? Like, how often do you guys communicate on that?
No, that's his responsibility now. I have my own things going on here, so we don't talk about the case.
Chief, how early on in the investigation did you realize that perhaps Cody Bigsby is responsible for Cody's missing?
Very early on. He's an incredibly poor liar, as you saw. There was very little that he had to say that seemed to map onto the truth. He was aggressive with his lies, which makes it especially egregious. So it wasn't real tough to figure out.
Chief,
Remember back when you first had that press conference, I remember being there, and there was some confusion. It seemed like he was at the station basically for several days being questioned, and at one point, I believe he asked for a lawyer but was still questioned. Anything you could say on that?
I've said a lot about that already. That, as I said back then, didn't get in the way of the case ultimately coming to a successful conclusion. If you look closely at any large investigation, you're going to find things that you're not completely happy about. I was not happy about that. The organization overcame it, and ultimately, if we are lucky, he will never get out of jail.
How behind did you all feel as investigators, behind the 8 ball? Anton Bell kind of spoke about that, just because you had that unreliable timeline, as you said. How behind did you feel?
So you rarely get the perfect investigation. There's always some fact or detail or circumstance that adversely impacts your ability to figure out what's happening. There's a special challenge when the crime actually occurred several months prior to coming in contact with the offender. But you don't really spend much time dwelling on it, to be candid. You simply accept the circumstances that you have and use what's at your disposal to investigate the case.
Chief, before we heard the name Cody Bigsby, we heard the name Noah Tomlin. Can you talk about just those two cases when a child is involved in a crime that's horrendous, that involves a young victim?
So I actually was police chief in Pennsylvania still when the Noah Tomlin case was going on, but I heard a lot about it from the investigators and officers who were working both cases, and it certainly is emotionally difficult for those who have experienced both of them. You don't go through this career without that happening at some point, and when it does happen, you never forget it. Those types of investigations keep pieces of you, keep parts of your soul, and I don't think you ever recover from it.
Chief, yesterday we had the opportunity to talk to him in jail in Suffolk. Did you have a chance to see any of that?
I saw a lot of it, yes.
What were your thoughts when you saw that?
A writer said, "A tale told by an idiot, sound and fury signifying nothing." That's what I thought.
You were in the courthouse early on during jury selection. You were subpoenaed for the entire week, correct?
Yes,
Were you subpoenaed as a defense witness?
I was.
What were you prepared to testify to, or what did they want you to testify about?
Well, I don't know, and I don't think they knew, which is why I didn't testify.
Speaking of the defense, they suggested multiple times an incomplete investigation from the police officers. What's your response to that assertion made in court?
I'd ask them what they think now.
Sir, I'm curious about I won't talk too much about the letters, but in the letters that he allegedly wrote, he listed an address in Maryland that I believe you and other agencies searched, and nothing came of that search. I was curious, was there ever discussion of having him actually ride along to show that location?
Well, we did talk about that. And, you know, at some point, if you spend any time with him, you come to believe him so little that it doesn't seem useful to ask for his assistance. And I think that is true for that circumstance. That would have been a thorough waste of our time.
No, we know you're not over Hampton Police Division anymore, but what are your hopes? Maybe the recovery of Cody? What do you want to see?
You know, for Cody's family, I hope that they get some peace out of the criminal justice system working. Having interacted with Cody Bigsby, I am not hopeful that we will ever find out what happened to Cody. I'm not at all hopeful. So that's completely up to him, as he, you know, I know he's a busy man, as he said, but maybe at some point he can see fit to let us all know what he did to his son. If he doesn't tell us, I think it is fairly unlikely we will ever know.
Early on, you said it seemed pretty obvious to you that he was the suspect, but was there any one piece of evidence or one thing that was said that really, I know the dogs were in the house and gave a signal. Was that something that you guys really took to heart, or was there anything further?
The story that he told, and the way he told that story. I have kids. I know what I would have been like had my child disappeared in the middle of the night. I'm pretty attached to the likelihood that any of my kids could have gotten out at 4 and they wouldn't even go into a dark bathroom at 4, let alone walk around the neighborhood. So the story was fairly absurd, and his demeanor while he was delivering an absurd story also was not consistent with somebody who was sick over their 4-year-old disappearing.
Was he too calm? Was he indifferent? Like what? How would you characterize those
We heard
first?
the 911 call during the trial.
Right.
And
Yeah.
He seemed a little short of breath, a little bit frantic on the 911 call. But it just those first, say, 48, 72 hours at police headquarters in Hampton, what was his demeanor then?
So, as you alluded to, on the 911 call, he sounded like a person who was out of breath. And I believe that's what he wanted to sound like. I don't believe he was out of breath. There was no reason for him to be out of breath. He wasn't chasing around anything. So the fact that he seemed to be out of breath never made any sense. His way of interacting was inconsistent with any parent I've ever encountered who lost their child. And I've been in contact with a lot of them. They've never, ever behaved that way. Never. They've always been completely cooperative. They've always been grateful for the help. They've always interacted with police in ways that are consistent with, we both want your child to be found safely. That's not what we had with Mr. Bigsby, not even close. So there was this sort of ostensible cooperation, but like being out of breath on the phone call, it wasn't real. It was an act, and a bad one on that.
He worked himself up into that prior to making the call?
Well, he had months.
Right.
He had months to come up with the performance that he came up with. And I'm not sure what he did over those months, but he did a perfectly terrible job of acting his way through interviews. But little that came out of his mouth or that you could see in his demeanor seemed to be genuine.
Mr. Bigsby said in jail that he felt set up during that interrogation leading up to the child neglect charges. How do you respond to that? I mean, he said he was being honest to you guys about leaving the kids at home. He felt set up. He said he wasn't charged with murder at that time.
Yeah.
What was your reaction?
What I remember from his interview, he said that we used his statements against him. Well, of course we did. What does he think? We were his friends, hanging out with him? We were investigating his allegations, and we were trying to find his son. He seemed to be genuinely surprised that he told us that he neglected his kids, and he ultimately was charged with a crime for neglecting his kids. Well, to most of us, that wouldn't be surprising.
This might be a better question for the Commonwealth, but in case you can answer it. Once he made the statement that was discovered in his cell December 25th of 2022, where he gave more detail and talked about beating the child to death, why was the case never charged as first-degree murder?
I agree. That's a question for the Commonwealth attorney. You know, it's just, from my standpoint, you are very inclined to disbelieve anything that comes out of him, and relying on the evidence and what you are able to prove is where the fruitful ground is with this investigation and prosecution.
Do you believe that he beat the child to death?
Absolutely.
Did
the final round?
did justice prevail?
You know, justice as the criminal justice process playing out the way that it's supposed to, but not very satisfying, frankly. You know, more satisfying than a not guilty verdict, certainly. However, what did he do with his son? Thank you.
You just heard from Chief Mark Talbot there. I just want to read off some of the headlines as we sort of wrap up this press conference. And it still seems, as if there are some more questions that need to be answered at some point. And you heard Chris Horn there ask one of the last questions that he did answer, but said, please refer to the Commonwealth's attorney on this. But some of the things that he said is that he's not hopeful at all that we'll find out what happened to Cody. That was something that he repeated a few times throughout the conversation. He says it's unlikely we'll ever know unless Corey provides that information. Even from the beginning, you hear Chris Horn ask some questions there and other reporters, but he's sharing that the story they heard originally was fairly absurd. He talked about the demeanor of Corey, throughout this case and compared it to other parents that he had spoken with that had lost children over the years. He said there were a lot of inconsistencies with that behavior and that cooperation. So he repeated those sentiments throughout his press conference there. You'll have to hear more from Chris Horn, of course, tonight on Wavy TV 10, and I'm sure we'll hear more as we have sort of wrapped up this trial. Now, the sentencing has not taken place yet. That will still come later, and we'll have more coverage on that down the line when that occurs. To find out more information about the case, there is a link if you're watching it on YouTube or on Facebook that you can click and go back to our previous coverage from the last 2 years. Of course, if you're watching on wavy.com, go to other articles that are linked within today's preview of the presser, and you'll have more from Chris Horn and reporters later. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.